Alright guys, let's continue with loop today again. Um how's what was that?
You take love already, or completely? We, the last one you take love, right?
Yeah, we just went over the first type of loop, right? So we're gonna continue with loops in Java. Um how are you guys so far? Like it's okay, the pace is fine? Yeah, okay. So that's good. Um alright. So just quickly, I guess go over one of the homework. The grocery one is just fairly very easy. Pretty much everyone, I think, got it. So one of the thing is with switch cases, I think you figure that out, is that you can't use that if it's a boolean, you can use that, and it makes sense, right? Because you're gonna have true false all over the place, and it doesn't make sense. And so I wanted you to kind of try it out and face that issue a little bit, and then I think you revert it back to if else. So there are some certain condition you have to use if else, and then there's certain condition you have to use switch. But I think you figured that out now. Um, I think the first one was, the second one was also fairly easy. I know, not sure how you guys done it, but this will pretty much do the job, right? So when we mentioned that we just need to find the percentage of between max score. I mean, we do this calculation all the time, right? When you go to a store, you see 15% off of something or whatever may be the case, right? So you always do a lot of the calculation in that way. So whatever your score is, then the max score. This could have come from anywhere, and then you just calculate the percentage. And once you got your percentage, then it's pretty straightforward of how you go forward with this. But you see how I've done one thing here? There's a scoping here that's happening. I set the letter grade to nothing, which is pretty much an empty string, because I didn't want to set any value here, right? It's not going to be hard coded. So when you don't put anything, it's essentially means null, right? Oh, sorry, not two equals. It's essentially mean nulls. Null means yes, the variable exists, right? But we have intentionally kept it empty, right? It's not really empty. There's a difference between null and empty, and we're going to talk about that later. Empty means this is already a string, and I just don't have the value in there, right? So it's a formed string, right? So that's an empty. But null is totally, nulls means, no, that's okay. All right. So null means the reference is there, but it doesn't, no value exists. So I know it's hard to understand. There's a difference between empty and the value doesn't exist just yet, right? We're going to assign something later down the road, so to speak.
Why not just keep it empty instead of putting the equal sign and null?
Oh, we're not doing that. I'm just showing you. So even when I do this, that's kind of like the same thing, right? And get used to null, because there are a lot of time you're gonna run into. It's something called null point exception. It's like, let's say you're trying to do something, but you never initialize the value. It's like you're trying to go into a web page and click on a button, but you never open the browser, so to speak. You never initialize. So I know, like, from user standpoint, it doesn't make sense, but when you're coding it, you don't see any of those things. It all has to be written and engineered in a way that you understand how it works. So null is something that you're going to get very familiar with as we start doing more realistic scenario. But then once you figure that part out, you could just say, oh, well, if percentage is, and then order of operations, right? We couldn't put this in the first because then everything would be pretty much be F, right? But so we say, okay, well, then let's do process of elimination. So 90, anything 90 to greater would be pretty much an A, and then I don't have to worry about that. If it's not, then it will fall into the second category. If is this percentage is greater or equals to 80, bam, we'll assign a B there. If it's greater than or equals to 90, we'll assign an A. B, if its percentage is greater than or equals to 70, we'll do a C, and then 60, we'll do D, and then if it's not any of those, I guess by default it will be less than 60, right? So in that case, we'll just by default we'll grade an F, and then we just formed a string here. You got a letter grade, and then a space, and whatever that percentage is, and you go from there, right? So I know some of you guys done this. You put another statement greater than and equals, which is fine, it's not wrong or anything like that, right? But in that case, you're doing almost two computations instead of just single computation. So I know those things doesn't really, with the naked eye, is hard to see the performance or anything like that. But it's just your preference, right? Of how you want to write it. But I wouldn't penalize you if you written the other way, right? As long as you kind of got the job done, that's what matters.
And if customer put a higher score than maximum score, what's going on?
Well,
Our maximum score is 100.
well, it can be, right? That's in theory.
110.
The whole point is the max score is the cap, right? You can't get anything more than that. That's the whole purpose of that, right? How can you get, if I mentioned the max score is 100, how can you get 101?
Yeah, my question is, we can this make it true false and go to top.
I'm not understanding.
Why? We can use the while. Can we use the while?
I wouldn't use a while here, right? If you use the while, we can go over it.
I try, but
Okay, so this is not the purpose to use while here.
While it's for loops.
Yeah. Again, now it's a very tricky time. Just because we went over something in last class doesn't mean that's what's gonna be exactly in homework. You have to pick and choose what is the best thing to use. What's up?
And this string letter grade that you set up to now, if we use it would work anyway, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't use it, you're probably going to just doing something like this, right?
yeah.
And you just say letter, but you're repeating a lot of things, right? So in this case, I realized that, well, we can just assign one letter and then finally form one sentence, right? So instead of just doing it each time, based on whatever the percentage is, we're just gonna give the grade and ultimately just print out the grade and form the sentence. So this is kind of like the preview of simplifying code base. So as we continue to kind of learn, and hopefully we can get to like methods and stuff today, and if we can, you'll see how our code is just gonna shrink and shrink, right? It's gonna get to a point where we're just seeing one liner, right? So this is kind of the beginning. Every time you're repeating something, that means you're doing something wrong, right? So if you're doing something wrong, then you probably have to figure out a way to simplify it. All right. I think that's good. Let's get into. We have a really interesting homework coming up, so I want to kind of go over some of the examples so you get some understanding of it. All right. Let's do one thing. Let me delete this. Oh, let's close that door. So do while. I don't want to spend too much time here. Let me see if we can do this in 4 to 5 minutes because it's not something that is being heavily used. It's there. I don't know when the last time I used it, but it's kind of part of Java, and there are maybe special cases where you may have to use it, so you know where it is, right? So the difference between do while and while is that do while evaluates its expression at the bottom of the loop instead of the top. So in while we evaluate right away, right? While, and then the evaluation kind of comes, and then in this case you actually execute first and then do the evaluate the condition. So therefore, the statement within the do block are always execute at least once, as shown in the following do while, right? So we're just gonna go over this right now. So let's say if we have do so that's pretty much it. So in while loop, we usually just do this first, and then actual the condition shows up, right? But in this case, so if I run this code, what am I expected to see? Can anyone guess? Sorry? 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Less than 5, right? So that's fine. So we get our count up to 4. Okay, that's fine because count is less than 5. So in this case, it doesn't matter if we use a while loop or do while loop. I like the while loop, the syntax looks a little bit cleaner. So in this case, it's totally fine. But what if the count is 6? So in this case, while loop would have never executed, right? Because in the very first condition, it's false. But in this case, well, even if it's false for the very first time, you're guaranteed to execute it once, right? So because the statement comes first, then the incrementer, right? And then the actual computation is here. So first, you're guaranteed to execute it once, regardless if it's true or false. If it's true, if it's always going to be true, but it has to be true, then you might want to use while loop, all right? So that's what a do while is. You're probably not going to see this ever again. So it doesn't matter much. Let's try out something called for loop, right? So the next thing is for loop, which is the most common one, right? So that's the one you really want to pay attention to and really understand how it works. And before we go to for loop, let's just go over the condition. So for loop works slightly different ways. You have more control, right? So with while loop and do while loop, it's the only control you have is true or false, right? You don't have control over how many times your loop has to get executed, right? But with for loop, we can control that. We can actually limit the iterations and all of those different things. We can also access arrays and all those good stuff, right? So that's when loop really being used with arrays. Every time, let's say you have a list of students, now how do you deal with that, right? You have list of tables. I mean, everything that we deal with is pretty much a list. So that's kind of what you want to focus on. For loop is gonna, every time you see an array, chances are there's a for loop followed by, because only way you can access those arrays is through the for loop, right? And then you write your condition within the for loop, and whatever inside of that array, you can do that, right? So let's focus on, so you have your loop will start here, initializations, followed by your conditions. If the condition is true, code inside the loop goes, obviously get executed, nothing different than a while loop, right? And then your counter gets updated. If it's false, then it'll stop, right? At any point the condition is false, it can stop. So the only thing here is you have initialization, condition, and update counter. So those three things is going to go inside of that loop condition. So let's build out the loop. We'll say for So very first thing, you have to create a variable here, like kind of like a temporary variable. So int I equals to 0. I is less than 100, and then you just want to say I plus plus. So if we go back to the diagram, initialization, right? Which point do you want this count to be started at, right? So in this case, we are going to start at 0, and then how far do you want to go? So it's less than 100, so it's 99, right? And then how often do you want to increment? We're going to be incrementing after each number, right? So, and then you can just do something like out, and you print out I. So I is kind of your temporary variable that's storing the iteration values, right? So the very first time it will execute, it will say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so forth, right? So right after your execution, it will go back here and increment 1 to it and so forth. So that's kind of how for loops looks like. So if you were to even access an array and stuff, we're going to see this in a few minutes. Hopefully your recording doesn't get bad.